Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this event presented by the Heritage Film Project in partnership with Book Passage Bookstore. My name is Erin Mathewson, and I'm your moderator tonight. I'm also a podcast producer and a writer for CNN. So excited about tonight. It's a book talk, a film screening, and a discussion about Bettye Kearse's acclaimed memoir, The Other Madisons, Lost History of a President's Black Family. And if you haven't read the book, don't worry, you can definitely read it afterwards. And after the film, you'll get to hear from the author herself, Bettye Kearse, who is a retired pediatrician and her family's oral historian. We also have Eduardo Montes Bradley on deck. He's the filmmaker of the documentary you're about to see, as well as the co-founder of the Heritage Film Project. And last but not least, we have Christian Coates. He's the CEO of the First Amendment Museum, and he's a former historian at Montpelier, which is President James Madison's plantation in Virginia. So without further ado, I'd love to turn over to Bettye before we start the film.
Thank you, Erin. It is indeed a pleasure to be part of this event and to meet our audience virtually. So as Erin said, we're going to talk about the book that took me 30 years to write. Maybe we'll get back to why it took so long and what I want people to take away from the book. And we're going to watch a film that brings the book to life. And then we're going to hear from Christian Coates, who will put everything into historical perspective. So please enjoy the film.
Well, then without further ado, yes, please enjoy the documentary, The Other Madisons.
The first horn lifts its arm over the dew-lit grass, and in the slave quarters there is a rustling. Children are bundled into aprons, cornbread and water gourds grabbed, a salt pork breakfast taken. I watch them driven into the vague before dawn while their mistress sleeps like an ivory toothpick and Massa dreams of asses, rum, and slave funk. I cannot fall asleep again. At the second horn, the whip curls across the backs of the laggards, sometimes my sister's voice, unmistaken, among them. "Oh, pray," she cries, "oh, pray." Those days I lie on my cot, shivering in the early heat, and as the fields unfold to whiteness and they spill like bees among the fat flowers, I weep. It is not yet daylight.
Well, there's quite a story about my family, where they came from. And actually, we did not start out in Oakland. And my family started out in Ghana, West Africa, if we want to go back to the first of our ancestors in this country. And her name was Mandy. And Mandy was a young woman when she was captured from the shore near her village when she was alone. And so an amazing part of our family story, and probably many other African American family stories, is that they survived the Middle Passage, and then they had to survive the breaking in period, not just physically, but also emotionally, as they had to adapt to becoming an enslaved person where they had been free in Africa. Often when I would get fidgety, especially while she was trying to get me to stand still as she made fancy dresses for my piano recitals, my mother would bring out the box of family memorabilia. and pull out items and tell me stories. Even before she started telling the stories, she would admonish me with our family credo, which has guided us for some 200 years. She would say, always remember, you're a Madison. You come from African slaves and a president. By repeating the credo at such times, she was telling me how proud she was of our ancestors, both white and black. But she was also letting me know how she was expecting me to behave. And the reasons were supported by those family stories that she was getting ready to tell me.
They can't tell you the name of the ship their ancestors came over on. They can't tell you the name of the village they were taken from. They probably can't tell you the names of the plantations that their families worked on, unless those plantations somehow, survived into their oral history, because that's how so much of these families' stories have been preserved, is through the oral tradition that they've passed down from family member to family member. And that's what Bettye's doing. She's the griot. She's the caretaker of her family's history.
According to the griot and griot tradition of my family, after Mandy was sold, she came to James Madison Sr.'s plantation.
When Mandy was purchased, probably in Fredericksburg, that would have been the closest slave market that James Madison Sr. was frequenting, I imagine. When Mandy was purchased, she would have been put in a wagon, potentially with other people. We don't have any records of when she might have come to the plantation, or whether it was by herself or with a group of other people. But we certainly know that Madison Sr. was buying enslaved people through the 1740s, 50s, 60s.
Glory to the Lamb, hallelujah, I'm staying bound for the promised land.
And also, according to the family oral tradition, Mandy was put in a remote cotton field so that she would be away from most of the activity of this huge tobacco plantation. And it was there that James Madison Sr. first saw her and became attracted to her. And the way the story is told is that he became attracted to her because she could pick cotton so fast.
When she arrived at the plantation, think about the culture shock that would have been for her. Here's probably the biggest house in the county is Madison's home. It's this massive brick mansion, much different than anything she's seen. Fields and fields of tobacco and corn, wheat, blacksmith operation, the forges pounding away. How different would that have been from her village in Ghana, in the Bight of Benin? There's actually a real similarity in the geography of Virginia and those countries that lie in the Bight, and there's a similarity between the forest and between the rolling hills and between the red clay soil that exists in both places. But the difference between her village and this plantation would have been immense. And of course the biggest difference is that she was totally under the thumb of the person who owned her, and she went from living a life of complete freedom to a life with none. And she was about to find out how little freedom and how little choice she would have.
I don't know exactly what happened. And I don't know whether or not there was assault, any form of violence, or if it was coercion, an effort to survive, an effort not to be punished in some sort of way, beaten, starved, or sold away. She was among the most vulnerable human beings in the world, and James Madison Sr. was among the most powerful human beings in the world. Wealthy, well-established Virginia planter. He had power. James Madison Sr.'s attention, the attention that he paid to her, led to the birth of a daughter whose name was Corinne. Corinne initially started picking cotton as a young girl, but later she was chosen to work in the kitchen.
So the Madisons had 2 kitchens underneath their duplex, their historic duplex, but they also had a kitchen outside, which I hear Montpelier is reconstructing, which is fantastic. And kitchens were typically moved outside. It started happening in these larger plantation homes right about the time where a lot of the enslaved were coming over and replacing the labor of the indentured white laborers. And so when you see the influx and the rise of enslaved Africans coming into the colony, and you see a decline of the white indentured servants, you see a separation of space within those homes. And the kitchens then began moving outside, not for fear of fire or heat. It was because of the need to sort of differentiate space and race during this period. Corinne, as an enslaved chef at a prominent house in Virginia, would have had different treatment than some of the folks in the field. And of course, this depended on the plantation that you were on. But typically, if you were an enslaved cook working inside of that house, you would have more power than anybody else. You were able to poison the person that enslaved you. And there's been several cases of enslaved cooks poisoning their enslaver, and whether it was intentional or they just left the food out too long is still sort of left to be determined. But that power that they had was something that was very much unique to the enslaved chef.
Well, I think the connection I have to my enslaved ancestors began to become stronger during the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power movement. And I think the whole country, especially the African American communities throughout the country, became more and more aware of their African roots. We were wearing dashikis and afros and shouting Black Power. It was a very unique time. Freedom over me. And I think just now we're beginning to become more and more aware of the contributions that the enslaved people made
many of us are becoming able to take pride in our ancestors, our enslaved ancestors. And I think that we're beginning to recognize that enslaved people had remarkable inner strength and a sense of hope. Otherwise, they would not have been able to survive.
Mandy worked based on Bettye's oral history that she's preserved and has been passed on through the family is in the kitchen. And the kitchen at Montpelier, the main kitchen throughout the 18th and early 19th century into the 1820s at least. And that's the area we've done archaeology on over the past decade and actually reconstructed the buildings. And in fact, the South Kitchen is what we call it. The South Kitchen today is literally being rebuilt from the ground right now.
So historic sites and plantations that interpret slavery have really come a long way. I think that it is incredibly important, though, visitors be able to empathize to some kind of degree about what it must have been like. Something about what it might have been like to live every day with the knowledge that your loved one could be sold and that you would never see them again. I also think that it is important to reconstruct slave dwellings based on really careful study and analysis and archaeological excavation. Because for a person to be able to walk into a space and feel that space in relationship to their own bodies, that is so much more impactful than just, reading about it.
And I'm glancing over here at the excavation of the kitchen. So I'm actually able to look at where she worked and just see the surrounding area and see some of the same things that she once saw. From the moment I told her my family's story, she was excited by it. And they had just discovered this kitchen, and she said, "You're an outsider, but I'm going to show you something special." And she took me to see the foundation of the kitchen, which was just sort of a rectangle of bricks with a pile of more bricks at one end, which was the cooking hearth. And she slipped open pulled back some of the blue tarp that was there. And, so I was able to see something real. And what else was real was at that time, there was a groove in the ground that led from the kitchen to the back of the mansion that had been worn there by generations of slaves walking to and from the kitchen to serve the Madisons. And I was able to actually walk in that groove. So I was literally able to walk in my own ancestors' footsteps. It's incredible. Yeah, that was an incredible experience.
My friend, I want to call your attention to the 8th chapter of the Gospel according to St. Luke and the 22nd verse. It came to pass on the certain day that he went out into a ship with his disciples and said unto them, "Let us go over on the other side of the lake." And they launched forth. But as they sailed, he fell asleep. And there came down a storm, a wind on the lake, and they were filled with water.
African Americans from the time of slavery through right now have made major contributions to this country. And James Madison in particular, without the luxuries that slave labor offered him, he would not have been able to go off to the College of New Jersey or whatever they called Princeton at that time and learn about the great political philosophers to formulate the ideas that are the basis for the United States Constitution. And without that Constitution, this nation would have failed.
Hallelujah, Lord. Hallelujah. Oh!
Well, I imagine her as beautiful, with rich, dark skin, perfect, smooth, beautiful skin. I imagine her body as being kind of sinewy and strong. And I imagine her having lots of red beads in her hair before she came to America, and ended up with just one bead in her hair that she cherished for the rest of her life.
Sanctified and holy, baptized with the Holy Ghost, my life is pure and clean. Lord Jesus will reign within.
For the past 20 years, since May of 2000, I've been the Director of Archaeology at Montpelier. And pretty much from the day I arrived at Montpelier, been interested in seeing how archaeology can bear witness to the enslaved ancestors of the larger Montpelier descendant community. With the material remains, the household broken items, the pottery, the ceramics, sometimes even bits of cufflinks and clothing that were left behind by the ancestors of Montpelier descendants. And with working with the descendant community, like with Bettye, all of a sudden these pieces, these fragments of the past come to life, because to work with descendants and you're finding their ancestor remains, the material remains from their households. And in some cases, you're not finding them as archaeologists, you're working with the descendants who are finding them themselves. They're the ones who are holding them in their hands. It is just mind-blowing, to be able to witness that, and to connect the descendants with their ancestors past, and all of a sudden you're helping to make their ancestors, who they don't know necessarily, in some cases Bettye does, but in other cases they don't know the names and certainly don't have photographs. All of a sudden you're able to make their ancestors real.
Just like the light of gold.
I'm a little bit ambivalent about my pride. Madison was a flawed human being, as we all are, but he did great things for the country. So that's where the pride is.
So as Corinne is growing up on the plantation at Montpelier, there are the Madison children who are coming of age at the same time, and so you have these adolescent young men who are on a plantation pretty far from any town of any significant size. There are other plantations around with other plantation owners' children around, but you have a handful of adolescent boys who are going to want to be adolescent boys. And as the plantation owner, a man in the 18th century is going to encourage his sons to let boys be boys. And of course, you don't want a pregnancy out of wedlock with a plantation owner's daughter. You certainly don't want your son potentially marrying down, if you will. So you would encourage them to practice, as it were, on the enslaved population, because after all, they were your property and they didn't have any choice in the matter. And the result of that behavior was an investment for the Madison family, right? So as enslaved women had children who were of mixed parentage, those babies were valuable enslaved property. And the lighter the skin, the more valuable the enslaved person. As the 19th century wore on and people began to be sold south into the deep south, as the soil plays out in Virginia and tobacco is no longer quite the cash crop that it was, what you find is Virginia becomes sort of the cradle for the Deep South. And all of these enslaved children in Virginia are being sold into Alabama and Mississippi and Tennessee and Arkansas and eventually to Texas. There are over 1.5 million people sold from the Piedmont and the Tidewater of Virginia and the Carolinas and Maryland, who either are shipped to New Orleans and sold from there, or they are chained together in coffles and marched from Richmond or from Charlottesville or from Raleigh or from Hagerstown, and they walk to Montgomery, Alabama. They walk to Nashville. They walk to Memphis, chained together by the dozens, or even sometimes, multiple dozens of people chained together. And this was not an uncommon sight if you lived in the South, watching hundreds of people walk down the road. 20, 30, 40-year process of that is what is creating the 4 million people that will eventually be in the South when the Civil War starts.
Well, when Jim was sold, he ended up in Tennessee. And we don't actually know what happened to Jim, but we do know what happened to his son, Emmanuel. So Emmanuel was owned by Jephthah Billingsley. So in 1848, Jephthah brought Emmanuel, his wife, Elizabeth, and his then 4 sons to Texas. One of Jephthah's sons was Jesse Billingsley. He fought at the Battle of San Jacinto, and he is the one who coined the battle cry, "Remember the Alamo." And they were under his ownership at the time that they were emancipated.
Whoa, freedom. Whoa, freedom.
My great-grandfather and one of his brothers, Giles, stayed with Jesse Billingsley as a tenant farmer. They were halvers, meaning that they had to give half of whatever they made.
Now I'll tell you what to say. Way back in slavery time, I was standing that's when the niggas were free. How we all got every day.
And my grandfather became Jesse's right-hand man.
I can be just good at this house. 6 and 8 mules to a county going through, and boats on them county. Then they put the wagon and have boats all on them wagons.
I would say one of the most amazing artifacts we've found at Montpelier is a very small ring, red in color. It looked like a plastic ring. It was so shiny. It looked like it came out of, out of a little Cracker Jack box or something. And I tapped it on my teeth, and it had this brilliant, sharp feel to it. And I was like, oh my God, this isn't plastic. This is potentially stone. And I immediately took it, and I did something that Ben was like, what are you doing? I scratched the window with it, and it scratched the glass. And I was like, Ben, this is cryptocrystalline quartz. This is a carnelian bead. This is from Africa.
I think after that first generation comes over on the slave ships from Africa, they are so their culture, they've lost so much of their culture. They weren't able to bring any or very few physical remnants of their culture with them. That ring, is a tiny piece of their culture that they may have been able to secrete away on the ship. And so the culture that they can bring with them is all stuff that they know in their head. So it's recipes, it's music, it's ways of praying, it's the gods that they bring with them. And that first generation, though, gets so their culture gets so trodden out of them that you don't really see that culture reassert itself until the second or third generation. They're not allowed to practice their culture in most instances. Funerals might be an exception to that, but that the gods and the religion and the way they pray and the music, you start to see that reassert itself in a Americanized way. And by that I don't mean anything to do with the Stars and Stripes, but in a way that's unique to the enslaved population of North America. And as they begin to be sold south, and their families are broken up, and they're removed further from their parents or their grandparents or people who were in the same villages that they were, it becomes even more fractured, and they hold on to little bits and pieces of it that you see sort of reasserting itself in a new way in this culture in the South. And probably the place you see that the most is in the church services that they begin to conduct, and the AME church in the South.
Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah to the Lamb. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah to the Lamb.
So after the Civil War, the name was no longer needed as a tool to find torn away loved ones. And now the name could be a source of pride. So Jim's son, Emmanuel, my great-great-grandfather, taught his children to be proud that their name had belonged to a president, and to make the most of that legacy now that they had the chance. So he added to the credo, and it became, always remember, you're a Madison, you come from a president. And that was the credo for the next 2 generations until my grandfather, my beloved Gramps, who was born free. He was Emmanuel's grandson. He was proud that his father and grandfather and other enslaved ancestors had overcome enslavement. So Gramps added 2 important words, African slaves. So the credo became, always remember, you're a Madison. You come from African slaves and a president. So for the last 100 years, the credo has reminded us that we're not just descendants of a president, we're descendants of enslaved people too.
While we don't have marked graves of the ancestors at Montpelier, like with tombstones with names and dates, we have found the ancestral cemetery of the enslaved Americans who lived, worked, and died at Montpelier. And we've found it all in one spot. It's one area that for years earlier archaeologists had found these depressions in the ground. And originally it was thought there was maybe 38 to 45 graves in this one area, but we've recently done ground penetrating radar. And what we discovered is there are hundreds of graves in this location. And what it makes us realize, it's this spot that's not just down the hill from the main house is probably where any member of the enslaved community during the Madison era who passed away was buried there.
We will march through the valley in peace.
When enslaved individuals died, somewhat paradoxically, that was one of the moments where the enslaved community had the most control over their lives. So through death, they controlled their day, that ceremony, that ritual. And enslaved people didn't always have control over their daily rituals. But with funerals, most slave owners, not all, but most, did not interfere with mortuary rituals, as far as we can tell.
We will walk here together in peace.
So for an enslaved individual, when they died, whoever their close family were, hopefully were at hand. And I say hopefully because in some cases the enslaved families had been separated over distance from sales, but your closest relatives would come to care for the body, undress the body, clean the body. This was work that was often done by women, and lay the body out. Especially in the South, you wanted to bury the body as soon as possible.
We will see.
Very often then, that evening, you would move to bury the body, but the funeral itself might occur days, weeks, months later, when people from different plantations and other enslaved communities were able to get word of the death and were able to travel to that plantation. And as you can imagine, all of these events that I'm saying, as if enslaved people had control of their daily lives, the reason why it worked is because these funerals, these memorials, these commemorative events were often held at night, and very often at midnight, in fact, when enslaved people, for the most part, were not in the fields working or not in the houses working and had some control over their own lives.
As I mentioned before, enslaved people were remarkable human beings who had inner strength and sense of balance and a sense of hope, and they had many talents, and they contributed mightily to this country. But I think it's important for us to remember today that when slaves died, they didn't take those qualities to the grave with them.
Oh, freedom. Whoa, freedom.
They passed them on to their descendants, including those of us alive today. So including me, including my daughter, Nicole, including my 2 grandchildren,
Justice!
one of whom is named Madison.
We don't get it! Shut it down! If you don't get it! Shut it down!
And so it would be 10 generations for Madison and Peter. But those qualities are still with them. And those qualities are still with other African Americans and the generations to come, as long as we remember our enslaved ancestors. And really, that's why the griot tradition is so important.
And another thing that I remember on the plantation that we haven't mentioned before was the churn song. Little Emma, the baby's nurse, after the baby was tucked in bed, was often called in the kitchen to do the churning. And this is a song that she sang to the milk. Come, butter, come, mister standing at the gate, waiting for the butter cake to come, butter, come. Come, butter, come, mistress a-waitin'. Come, butter, come, mistress a-waitin'. Come, butter, come, the missus a-waitin'. Come, butter, come, the missus a-waitin'. Missus a-waitin' for the butter cake to come, butter, come. Come, butter, come, missus a-waitin'. Missus a-waitin' for the butter cake to come, butter, come. Missus a-waitin'. Come, butter, come, the missus a-waitin'. And this chant would go on through until the churning was finished, and the rich golden butter would come into a solid cake on the top of the milk.
I always enjoy watching that. I feel like every time I watch the film, I learn something different. I was actually thinking, Bettye, I was thinking about how your ancestor helped the credo evolve. So it went from, don't forget, you're a Madison, you came from a president to you came from a president and African slaves. And I wonder if you would ever add to that credo again, and what would it be?
I don't think I would add to the credo, except to remind people as they repeat the credo that, as I stated in the film, enslaved people were remarkable individuals, and those of us alive inherited their very powerful qualities, and that we should be able to nurture those qualities in ourselves. So I don't think I would actually make the credo longer, but I would sort of tag on a little lesson, as I'm repeating it to my grandchildren.
Oh, I love that. Well, I'm going to open this up to Christian and Eduardo, but I wanted to ask you, Bettye, you said you spent 30 years writing this book, and we just watched this film. What do you think, how does the book differ from the film, besides, being on a page and things like that?
The book is my personal journey. It's a memoir. And so I came to question the credo, always remember you're a Madison, you come from African slaves and a president. So for me, it resounded with the abuses of slavery. And as the new family griot, the family oral historian, I decided that I wanted to tell the whole story. So the book describes my journey of discovery, of my ancestors, our nation, and very importantly, of myself. So it's about my take on the history of my family and the history of the country, and how it shaped who I am and what I think is important to pass on to future generations.
Lovely. Eduardo, as the filmmaker, I'm curious, how does, when you were creating the film, how did you lift it from the pages and make it visual? How is it different for you?
I think that as I was listening just now to Bettye talk about how where she came from writing it, I think it's two completely different perspectives. To her, it's personal. I feel like I come through a window, and as a tourist of a historical period, I'm going in to discover, to try to visualize, to try to create the atmosphere using music and effects, using tempo, semantics. Is the language of film is different than the language of nonfiction, even if the film itself is nonfiction. The audience is used to two different tempos. One, when reading, is something you can do, and it's very introspective. It's something you do sitting by a window, having a cup of coffee, tea, or a drink, and stopping to think, and then you pick it up again. A film is more like a journey in which you're sitting on a train and looking out the window. And I have to lead the audience through that experience. So I did it, like I said, as a vocational tourist through history. And that's how I find the evidence that I need, first to show it to myself and then to show it to you.
So yeah, so less personal, but it's important because you're a tourist. You're seeing this from a different perspective than Bettye.
Absolutely, and let's not forget the fact that I can take more risks because I'm going in and out. I can visit the period. I can visit her story. I can envision it. I can process it with my own, with my abilities, which are different as well. But I can always get out. She can't.
I'm noticing, Aaron, that Eduardo and I both use the word journey. So we begin at one point, and at the end, we end up at another point, hopefully having grown and having learned something along the way.
Mm.
Oh, I feel like you'd have to try hard not to learn something. Yeah, that's awesome. Well, Christian, you were kind of involved in both projects, and I'm wondering what was the most exciting part for you, or how was it different working on the book and on the film for you?
Well, I didn't really work on the book. I read a couple of early drafts of Bettye's book many years ago. She's been working on this since before I met Bettye, and I was at Montpelier for 20 years. I guess I probably saw first draft not until, I don't know, the 20-teens sometime, I think maybe 2012, 2013, something like that, Bettye. And I and other people at Montpelier would comment on the history of it. I mean, that was sort of our role, is to say, could this be this person? Could that be that person? Did this happen? Could that happen? But I love the way that Bettye took the book as in the memoir fashion of it, and made it about her and her journey discovering her family's history. The metaphor that you guys were using about the tourist through history is just perfect. Working on the film was completely different. I had already left Montpelier by the time the film started shooting, and so I was just delighted that they still wanted me to be part of it. And Eduardo came up to Maine, and it was really, I think, if you can get Eduardo talking about how fractured the filming of this thing was. I mean, you don't realize that in the film itself, it's so seamless. But Eduardo had to go to New Mexico and to Maine in the middle of a pandemic to make this thing happen. And it was just probably a phenomenal experience for him.
Yeah, well, Eduardo, I'd love to hear about that. How was that for you?
Yes, and let me add something. I will go right into that because it's a great question, but let me expand a little bit on this idea of tourism. I think that something of mini tourism also happened with Bettye in her book. If you see, when she uses an extraordinary recourse, which is she embodies her ancestor Monday, and she speaks with her voice, which is a number of episodes in the book where the typeset is in cursive, italic, as if Mandy is the one talking through her, which is what we all do when we try to interpret reality, when we try to interpret history. But we'll be fools to believe that Bettye doesn't have a way out. She does have a way out. She can stop being Monday. I can walk away from the movie, but Bettye cannot escape out of being Bettye, and I cannot escape of being me. I think it's a wonderful game when it comes to that, which is getting in somebody else's, under someone else's skin, and how they feel. So I think that in a way, just like Bettye got under the skin of Mandy, at some point, I was trying to get under the skin of Bettye. And I think that's why we became very good friends. Now, with regards to the process of making the film, it was very scary. First of all, because I was extraordinarily paranoid with the COVID situation. I took it extremely seriously. I know other people didn't, but I did. I needed to see Bettye and get her on film so we can make this film together. I didn't want to get on an airplane. I didn't want to travel by train. I didn't want to rent a car because who knows who was in that car before me. So I bought a new car and got on that car and drove all the way to New Mexico with two members of my family for company and safekeeping. Slept in the car, and the same thing when I went to see Christian in Maine. And the rest of the film was made right here where I'm sitting right now, just tapping into my digital resources. But it was a film done in a bubble, almost like the kid in the bubble that, you know. So I came through the window without never ever leaving my screen. It's a very interesting. I think it's a with regards to that, it's almost a futuristic film.
Bettye, I'm so curious, you know, I feel like your book is part of American history, and there's so much people can learn. And I was struck in the film how there's a woman at Montpelier who says they wanted to make sure that that people who visit Montpelier have empathy for the enslaved. And I'm wondering, do you think your book does the same thing? Do you think someone would walk away and have empathy for the enslaved?
Oh, I certainly hope so. My ancestors came alive for me, especially when I was able to walk literally in the footsteps of one and go to the gravesite of another and just know that she was there. And I hope that same sense of being part of the history and part of the story and getting to know these people who live the story happens for the reader too, you know, not just for me as the writer and researcher, but for the reader, yes.
Christian, when you left Montpelier, did you get to stay connected to this work? I guess you helped with the film, but do you still stay connected to what's happening there?
I try to. I try not to butt in, but I try to stay connected. When I walked into this office, which is, you know, I'm in Augusta, Maine, and at the First Amendment Museum, the first day I walked into this office, there was nothing on the desk except for one card, you know, like a greeting card that had been sent, addressed to me at the museum. And I well, who is that from? And I opened it up, and it was from another member of the descendant community, Dr. Iris Ford. And I was just so tickled that a person from the descendant community from Montpelier would be thoughtful enough, you know, to send me a card at my new gig in Maine. It was just it made me feel so connected to that group of people and to back home. It was a really nice feeling. And right now I'm working on an article with two other members of the descendant community for a publication for the American Alliance of Museums for a book that they're producing. So I try to keep my feet, you know, or my toes in the mix as much as I can without abandoning my duties here at the First Amendment Museum. But we also, at the end of my tenure at Montpelier, we had just wrapped up a lot of work creating what's called the Rubric for Engaging Descendant Communities in the Interpretation of Slavery at Historic Sites and Museums, which is a long title. But it's a rubric of best practices for how other historic sites can work with descendant communities to do what you were talking about before, to how do you both represent the descendant community and the story of the enslaved well in the interpretation so that visitors will engage with the history, so that they will empathize with the lives of the enslaved, and so that you will, as a museum, you are provoking thought in visitors that they haven't, you know, they might not have wrestled with before, right? You're introducing them to history and making them look at history in new ways that often is uncomfortable for many museum goers, but you're doing it in a way that sort of brings them in a little bit at a time to make them empathize with those stories and think harder about those stories that they, you know, probably never spent a lot of time thinking about before.
I think that's so fascinating, and that's such important work because connecting people with descendant communities and how to be respectful and sensitive to everything that is going to come up. I think it's great that you're sharing best practices.
Well, I think what Betty's book, Eduardo's film, the interpretation at Montpelier, the rubric on engaging descendant communities, what they all do is try to connect the dots, right, from the past to the present, and to give people a better understanding of where we've come from as a society and as a nation, and shed light on that history. The what my old boss used to call the both and of history.
Well, we only have a few minutes left, so you all three of you have worked together for a little while, right? How long have you guys been working together on this?
Several years, I think.
On the film. I'm sorry, I didn't hear what Eduardo said.
I said that for several years, one way or another, because I Betty, while I was working with a Christian with other stuff at Montpelier, I think it was Juneteenth celebration. I don't exactly recall when, but yes, we were familiar faces to each other, certainly.
I've known both of you for well over a decade.
I'm curious for
about 20 years, Christian, you've known me. Yeah. Almost 20 years.
That's right.
Oh, that's amazing. That's very special.
Well, it's all through Montpelier, which brings together a lot of people who are committed to telling the whole story.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, that's important. Not just part of it, not just the pretty part. In the few minutes we have left, I'm wondering if we could do a little speed round. What was the most rewarding part for you, Betty, the book, Eduardo, the documentary, and Christian, everything?
Well, for me, it was the awesome feat of writing a book and getting it published and being able to share that message about enslaved people and how we should embrace our slave ancestry. I think it's a very important message, particularly today, as we continue to try to deal with the effects of slavery, which has morphed into racism.
Eduardo, what do you think?
Well, I think that for me, it moved me towards a better understanding. And I like to make a difference between understanding and empathy, which was the word used previously when we said, how could we contribute to building empathy on an audience? And I think that perhaps the question there should be formulated differently. I think that if they don't have empathy for the subject, they're most likely not going to be around to see the movie or read the book. What I hope is not that they feel empathy, but that they walk away with a wider, greater understanding of the subject matter. Because without understanding this particular period and what is on Betty's book, on my film, and on Christian's long time commitment to this work, is the clue to understanding the present. So I walked out of this experience with a greater understanding of a subject matter that otherwise would have remained pretty much foreign to me. And it's not now.
Nice. Okay, Christian, bring us home.
I think the most rewarding thing for me throughout my 20 years at Montpelier was being able to meet the dozens of people who are in the descendant community and being entrusted by them, by being entrusted by Betty, to be the caretaker of their story at Montpelier and being entrusted to tell that story to the nation at a national historic site, even if it was just for a little while, but I had my day in the sun there, being the caretaker of that story, and having that trust. I will always remember that as one of the highest points of my career.
Well, as someone who just, I get to just hang out with you guys from time to time, I think it's really inspiring just to see so much history in both visually and on the page, because I know I don't know as much about my family, and this kind of is like a blueprint for how you might go about finding your own family history, and I just think that's really helpful. But I wanted to thank all of you, Bettye, Christian, Eduardo, for talking about your work, about the book, the Other Madisons, and the documentary. And I want to thank the Heritage Film Project and Book Passage for giving us the time to talk. This has been really lovely. And of course, you can watch this film online, and also you can get the book online and at your local independent bookstore. So definitely check it out. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.